Hi, Cara.
Hi, Vanessa. I'm excited to talk about concussions today.
Yes, you're probably the only person excited to talk about concussions. I mean, I am because I'm with you, but like in general, mostly people are not so excited to talk about concussions.
No, but see, knowledge is power, Vanessa. And that is why we're doing an episode on concussions. And I want to make sure we frame this and we let people know what we're going to cover because we'll do a little bit of teaching about what a concussion is, but mostly what we want to talk about is concussion in both sports and recreational activities. And so lots of opportunities for lots of people to get a concussion, to be around someone who has a concussion, to know what to do and to figure out. And I will say there's a newsworthy piece to this particular topic. And that is that the American Academy of Pediatrics has recently called for cheer to become a sport. Now, cheerleading, is an activity that is extraordinarily athletic. We're going to talk about that in this episode. But one of the many reasons why the AAP is making a big push for it to be included in the world of sports and to be labeled as a sport, which it isn't always, has to do with concussions.
Mm.
So there you go. You sounded really excited there.
I mean, listen, we both have kids who are competitive athletes. Your kid is a rower, so the risks to concussions are fewer. I won't say.
Coincidence? I don't think so.
And as I will often own on this podcast, I am a hypocrite, or not a purposefully, willfully hypocritical person. But as with so many things in parenting, I make certain judgments about certain things and then make certain exceptions to other things, or worry about one thing and don't worry about another thing. And even though they still have the same underlying issue. So I want to say that up top because I have kids who play all different kinds of sports that have high risks of concussion, like soccer, like lacrosse, like basketball. And yet I don't let my kids play tackle football. I know that there's all sorts of inconsistency in that decision as a parent. So I say that up top, even though we're going to delve into some of the medical stuff first, Cara, that what we're going to talk about on this podcast is partially based on, the science and the data and all of your training as a physician. And we are not standing here in judgment from on high, telling people the absolute right or wrong thing to do. What we're going to do is give you the scientific information, give you some ways to think about it, give you some ways to be in conversation with your kid, and then empower you to make the decision that's right for your family without judgment or self-righteousness, because at least I have been on the other end of the calculus and have probably made very imperfect decisions.
I'm gonna give you a little bit of a break here, Vanessa, because the very first concussion I ever got called about as a physician was a kid who was playing on the little grassy area at school and he ran into a tree. Like, this conversation is not exclusive to tackle football or cheer or soccer and we'll go through the list of higher risk sports, but you get to get a huge pass on labeling yourself a hypocrite because just operating in the world as we know it, there are concussion risks and we accept those risks. We accept all sorts of injury risks around us. And so much of the importance of this conversation is really just knowing, how do I identify that I have one? And what do I do about it? And whose advice do I follow? And those answers are very quick and easy. And then what we're really going to get into is this sort of exactly what you've just laid out, which is this guilt and shame layer around, what if our kids really want to do something that puts them at high risk for a traumatic brain injury, which is the fancy phrase that we use to describe concussion. Now what? How do I parent around that? How do I grandparent around that? How do I how do I be the teacher on the playground duty, managing that, right? So that's what we're gonna talk about. And maybe why don't we kick it off by just doing a little bit of quick science at the top?
Yeah.
And then I think we should share a really interesting DM that you got from a listener.
Great.
So let's start with the stats. And I got a lot of my data. I've written a lot about concussion over the years, but a lot of the newest data is all consolidated on the CDC website. They have a program called Heads Up. I did not name that program, Vanessa.
But
You'll
if
be
you had
shocked.
been given a chance to name it, you would have named it exactly the same.
I might, yeah, I might have. I might have a long lost sibling who named that program. But it's all the data on sports and recreation activities and that data around traumatic brain injury. So traumatic brain injury is exactly what it sounds like. Your brain has trauma. Just to level set for anyone who's unaware of the anatomy, the brain, which is a mass that is just packed with neurons, nerve cells. The brain sits inside the hard skull, but between the brain and the hard skull is a layer of fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. And that fluid actually goes all the way around the brain and then all the way down the spinal cord, which is why you get spinal in the name. And that cerebrospinal fluid has a number of very important jobs, but one of them is to protect the brain from injury. So how does it do that? It acts like a shock absorber. So your brain it doesn't free float, but it a little bit free floats inside your skull. And when you knock your head back and forth, then the brain can move within the skull. And the fluid of the cerebrospinal fluid creates a cushion that allows the brain to move without banging against the skull. We need the skull to be like a helmet. It's our built-in helmet, right? But that fluid is really what protects the brain on a minute by minute basis. And so, in order to get a concussion, which I want you to think of, this is an oversimplification, but I want you to think of it as a bruise on the brain. In order to get a concussion, your brain must get knocked or jarred enough that it gets inflamed, it gets bruised. And one way that happens, in fact, the most common way that happens is the head jerks in one direction or jerks in one direction and then back in another direction. And the brain ricochets and the cerebrospinal fluid, which normally will cushion the blow, gets pushed out of the way like someone's diving into a pool. And it's not sufficient to protect the brain from banging against the skull. And then you have what amounts to something that's really no different than knocking your shin against a table leg, right? It's ouch and that hurts. And now we're going to get some swelling and some bruising. And that's what's happening inside your brain with a concussion. And there are a couple different kinds. There are concussions that happen at the spot where the brain actually hits the skull. And then there are some that happen at the opposite side of the brain. So the brain ricochets back and forth and it hits one side of the skull hard, but the opposite side of the skull, when it's kind of ricocheting backwards, even harder. And that can cause concussion. I mean, again, this is not a deep science dive into concussion. We've written a lot about it. I point you to Decoding Boys. There's a whole chapter about concussion and brain injury in there. But I would suffice to say, if you think of a concussion like a bruise in the brain, what happens to a bruise, Vanessa, over time?
Well, first it swells and then the swelling goes down.
Correct. And that's what people point to when they talk about healing concussions. It's allowing that swelling to go down. And I'll do one last sciencey thing before we move on to other important conversations around this. The one more sciencey thing is, Vanessa, if you kick your shin against a table leg and it doesn't fully heal, and then you trip on that same little spot on your rug and you hit that exact same spot on your shin before the bruise has fully healed, in your experience, does it hurt more, less or the same as the first time you hit it.
Yeah, I mean, it hurts like hell, and then it takes a really long time to heal.
Right. And so in the brain, when that happens, it's called second impact syndrome. So if your bruise is not fully healed in your brain and you go out and you re-injure your brain, it's an already inflamed area. And if it gets hit a second time, it can swell not just faster, but also more. And here's something very significant about the brain. The skull is a really effective helmet because it holds the brain and the cerebral spinal fluid in nice and tight, but it holds the brain and the cerebral spinal fluid in nice and tight, which means if there is swelling in the brain, there is nowhere for that swelling to go. It's not like on your shin where you can get a big goose egg and there's room for that swelling to come out. In the brain, the swelling is pushing up against a firm, hard skull. And that is where catastrophe can happen. I mean, there are a lot of places where sort of traumatic brain injury can cause problems, but when you read about going back to sports too quickly, really that's what you're reading about. You're reading about second impact syndrome, and the swelling can happen so fast the second time that the very hard skull can essentially act like a vice on the brain. It just creates a ton of downward pressure, and that can be catastrophic.
And Cara, what are the long-term effects of repeated concussion, or not letting a concussion heal and second impact? Like what's the downstream effects of that?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are a lot of short-term impacts about concussion that you can find pretty much everywhere you look, and you know them, right? Headache, nausea, vomiting, seeing double, hearing things like ringing bells, literally getting my bell rung. That was a description that came from one of the symptoms of concussion. But you're asking for the longer term, which is really important because not a lot of people talk about this. So we definitely see learning difficulties, confusion, memory loss, or difficulty with memory gain. You can have long-term vision changes. Headaches, chronic headaches are things that people can often struggle with chronic, ongoing, slow to heal concussion. In really significant traumatic brain injuries, you may have difficulty moving a part of the body. You may have difficulty speaking. You may have difficulty writing. Personality change,
Mm-hmm.
right? Mood swings from recurrent concussion. So there's a ton of research that's been done over the past 20, 25 years on concussion, especially on concussion in young kids. There's a researcher at UCLA who is one of the many around the country who has done a ton of great work, a guy named Chris Giza. And they're collecting a lot of really good data to try to separate out what comes first, the chicken or the egg. That's where a lot of these researchers have come up with these baseline concussion exams that kids will get before a sports season. The idea being, let's measure where their brain is today. And then if they get a hit in the head, we can have them take the same test and we can see where they are from their baseline. These are really, really important shifts in the way that we've handled concussion medically over the past couple of decades. But the advice on how to treat concussion, that keeps changing.
Right. So we'll get to that in a second. And I just want to underline, Cara talked about the long-term stuff, and those of us who, read frequently about NFL players and research being done on NFL players and autopsies on their brains and players struggling with depression and suicidality, some of whom have died by suicide. I mean, there are very, very serious can be very serious mental health impacts of traumatic brain injury. Another population are veterans of war that have been near by very powerful blasts over a sustained period of time. I mean, there's really frightening news out there. And one of the hardest things as a parent is to figure out, like, okay, what's applicable, like, to my kid and my family versus what's going on in the world in much more extreme circumstances.
Yeah, that's right. And let's be super clear about what you're describing. It's very important for people to understand what you're describing because it's critical in terms of the choices you're going to make as a parent or trusted adult. You're describing chronic traumatic encephalopathy. These are the long-term changes in the brain as a result of what we believe to be as a result of recurrent concussion. Those hits to the brain and the consequences of those hits to the brain were first picked up in autopsies of professional football players. And this is what I write about in Decoding Boys, and all the data around traumatic brain injury and those long-term effects that now, we used to only be able to see them in autopsy. Now there are new studies that are starting to show evidence of CTE through medical imaging, which is incredible. And I'm going to connect it with something that Vanessa knows where I'm going with this, but you, the listener, may be surprised. There's actually even a connection between CTE and strangulation during sex. So this phenomenon of choking someone or strangling them while having sex. Peggy Orenstein wrote about it in an op-ed for the New York Times several months ago. And she talked about how there is evidence that strangulation may actually cause the same type of damage in brains that repeated concussion does. And it all boils down to this bucket called CTE.
And if you were not prepared, as I was, for Cara to go to that place in this conversation about concussions, but want to learn more, you can listen to our interview with Debbie Herbenek, who was the researcher out of Indiana University on whose work Peggy Orenstein based her op-ed. Okay, so Cara, as a parent of youth sports athletes for now almost 2 decades, I know from personal experience, the advice about managing concussions has changed dramatically, almost incessantly. Where is the medical establishment these days on treating concussions, and what are the parameters?
Well, I think the most interesting place to start is with figuring out who's getting treated for concussions, right? So if you go onto the CDC Heads Up site, all of this data is there. But when you look at emergency room visits for sports and recreation related injuries, for anyone 17 or under, 70% of those visits are for traumatic brain injury and concussion. And then when you look at who's sitting in the ER to get their treatment, there are twice as many boys than girls. Why is pretty interesting, Vanessa. One of the reasons why is that there are many more eyeballs on boys' sports, believe it or not. There is a higher likelihood that someone is sitting by the sidelines who will identify that a male athlete needs medical help just because of sheer numbers. However, if you dig deeper in the data, what you find is sports-related concussions are actually reported more by girls than by boys when they self-report. Why? Probably because females are better at reporting their symptoms. And this is learned. This is taught and learned. And it's going to be the most important takeaway we give at the end of this episode. And I'm just going to put it out here right now is there is nothing that is not fierce about identifying that you might have a concussion and you need to sit out. And it's critical for kids to know that, for parents to know that, for coaches to know that. The highest risk sports are contact sports, and they account for 45% of all of those emergency room visits. But kids get concussions and TBIs when they're on bikes and on playgrounds too. As you know, kid ran into a tree, right? And then I wouldn't be responsible without mentioning ATVs. The risk of concussion, traumatic brain injury, and death from ATV accidents is much higher than many people realize. And this is true even though kids are often wearing helmets. So that's the who we're talking about and how many. It's a lot of kids. And then they're all being seen by all different emergency department doctors all over the country. If they're being seen, sometimes they're seen by their pediatricians. Sometimes they're being seen by a healthcare extender, by a nurse practitioner or an MA or a school nurse. And sometimes they're not seen at all. And The general thought of what you should do with a kid who has had a concussion, let's say there's agreement that the kid has had a concussion, which I think now it's pretty fair to say that most healthcare providers are in agreement of when it's happened. Then the question is to scan or not to scan. Is that part of their treatment? And to rest or not to rest. These are the two big questions. So we should start with scanning. And I'm curious, Vanessa, having, as many kids as you have so many kids, do you have a sense on what the philosophy is these days about scanning?
So my kids have never been scanned for concussions. They've been treated for concussions, but they were never scanned. And the debate, at least in my house, in treating them was more about rest and what did rest consist of. Did it include screen rest? So earlier, my concussions with my older kids, it did include total rest, dark room, no screens, no reading, no nothing. Over time, it has evolved, and it was more about what could they tolerate? Like, were there headaches or were there not headaches? Could they focus or could they not focus? And essentially, it turned into, at least in my experience, what could they tolerate and what they could tolerate. And meaning tolerate, not just like withstand, but like actually felt okay to them, was kind of what dictated. But they do sway tests, which is one of these baseline concussion tests ahead of every sports season or ahead of every year before they begin sports. And there is a minimum 2-week no play requirement for them, that they are at least out for 2 weeks, if not longer, before there's any version of return to play. So that's been my experience. I don't know, Cara, how that jives with your opinions.
Dr. Kroll Bennett, everyone.
By the way, that was all because of the good advice of the physicians.
Excellent.
That told us what to do.
Care.
And trainers and athletic trainers at their school.
So you got excellent care. So let me start with imaging. By and large, concussions are clinical diagnoses, which means that you hear the history, you do a physical exam, and you can come up with a diagnosis. And actually, the imaging is generally to rule things out. You can't diagnose a concussion on a CT scan. The bruising, the inflammation is not that quick, and it's not visible. What people who are scanning a brain are looking for is bleeding. Bleeding can come from a traumatic brain injury that is significant enough that it causes a fracture of the skull or a shearing of the blood vessels that are lining either the skull or the outside of the brain. That is why someone might scan. By and large, this is not a standard thing, although everyone, myself included, have heard those once in a lifetime stories of the kid looked perfect in the emergency department and the parents insisted on a scan, and lo and behold, there was a teeny little bleed. And had they not picked it up, something catastrophic could have happened. Well, I acknowledge those stories, and I'm so grateful that those stories, usually when they're told like that, have a happy ending. Scans are not benign. CT scans have a tremendous amount of radiation, and MRI scans, when you use contrast in order to see blood, the contrast material is called gadolinium, and gadolinium has its own long-term impacts. It collects in the kidneys, and some people think it can deposit in the brain, and this isn't benign. So if you think you're doing your kid a favor by demanding imaging, my advice to you would be to be in conversation with the care provider about the pros and cons of imaging and what you're worried about and what they think they're worried about. That's imaging. So you got good advice there. Also, you've summarized the care plans very beautifully. So in general, it went from when I was first a pediatrician, kids were basically locked in dark, quiet rooms. Now, I do understand. It's kind of amazing to take advantage of an opportunity to say, turn off your screens and that music and whatever. It didn't translate into faster recovery. It didn't translate into lower incidence of recurrence. It didn't fix very much.
And it's depressing and lonely and isolating for them.
Which is really significant.
Yes, it was when I had to treat a kid's concussion like that, it was tough on the kid and tough on everybody because you're already worried and then you have a kid who's feeling really isolated. And so I was grateful when the guidance changed.
Now, I will say the new guidance requires kids to be honest.
Right.
To be good reporters. And it's really hard for them when they want to be in a game or they want to not be at home anymore. It's really hard. Some of them will tell us they flat out lie. Most of them are not flat out lying. Most of them are aware. They're acutely aware of how serious concussion is, but they will, in fact, not perceive the symptoms that they have as being significant because their desire to be back in the swing of things is so great. And so they might not realize that their vision hasn't restored to normal, or they might ignore that 2 out of 10 headache that's just sort of there at baseline because they want to get back to school and friends 10 out of 10, right?
Right.
So that's the hard part. That's what locking them in a quiet, dark room solved for, but it didn't solve anything.
So, Cara, we got this awesome DM with a totally relevant question, and I'm going to read the full question, and then we're going to kind of break it down and use it to help guide our conversation about how we make decisions in our own homes.
Love it.
Okay. Hi, Cara and Vanessa. I would love to get your opinion on youth tackle football in an upcoming episode. You're welcome. My 8th grader is begging me to let him play tackle football next year in high school, but I'm really concerned about the short-term and long-term dangers of the sport. We now know the high rate of CTE among former football players and the host of other mental and physical problems football players face later in life. I recently read a study that showed even one season of playing high school football can lead to changes in accelerated aging of the brain. Despite the latest research, youth football is still very popular in our area. My son has tried many different sports and activities, but hasn't found anything he's passionate about and wants to continue. Football is really the only thing he's interested in right now and is one of the few no-cut sports for boys in our high school. On one hand, there are many benefits to playing, including making new friends, getting exercise, and having a sense of belonging at a new school. On the other hand, the risks to his future physical and mental health seem too great. To play or not to play? Please help.
It's such a good question that we get often in a lot of different forms. And I want to add really quickly the layer of football is also, for some people in some communities, a way out. Mm-hmm. It is an incredible opportunity to get an education and to have a career. And that is an important piece to add into this conversation as well. So I think maybe let's start a little bit with helping break down some of the numbers, right? So if you look at the data on concussion, the number one cause of sports-related concussion for kids under the age of 17 is, or under 18, 17 and under, is boys tackle football. Tackling is responsible for about 63% of the concussions that are seen in football. Interestingly, I will say, second on the list is girls soccer. And then I'm just going to read them down. Boys lacrosse, boys hockey, boys wrestling, girls lacrosse, girls field hockey, girls basketball. Interesting because the mechanisms for concussion in these different sports is different. So the risks in each of these sports is different. But we're going to focus on football here for a second because that's what the question is about. The writer of the question specifically talked about CTE. They are reading the same data that we are reading, and we've published some of these articles in our newsletter. So one that came out, for instance, recently, suggesting that 1 out of every 3 former NFL players believe they have CTE. Another showing that when looking at 376 autopsy specimens from different football players, 376 football players, 345 of them had CTE. I mean, the numbers are devastating. And so the fair dots that they are connecting are basically more play, more concussion, higher risk of CTE. Where we don't have real answers, Vanessa, is in the middle and high school population of players. And this is a massive population. So I personally think it's really, really tricky to say, we know there are all these concussions that happen in tackle football. We know it's the number one reason that people end up in an emergency department with TBI, traumatic brain injury. And we know that when you're a professional football player, your risk of CTE is devastatingly high. Therefore, we can say that playing tackle football in youth is connected with CTE. We can't do that last part yet. There are a lot of people trying to figure out if there is a direct connection. The evidence is starting to point towards yes, but we have to have evidence. And some of the reasons why we might argue maybe it's not as direct a connection as we think has to do with the weight and size of kids who are playing. So a 6th or 7th grader who is playing tackle football, they are in a very, very different circumstance than an 18 or 20 or 25-year-old. A lot of the studies that I've been reading recently look at the unfair matchups between two players of the same age, but of vastly different sizes.
Yep.
And that is frankly where I think we are going to see the most convincing data come out. If there's a 7th grader who outweighs another 7th grader by 50 pounds and they are playing tackle football, I have to believe that the mechanics and the impact on the brain are somewhat similar. So it's a lot of like medical talk, but you want to boil it down into non-medical speak?
Yeah. I mean, I think so for this listener who wrote in, yes, if your kid plays in high school, the data points us to the fact that they are at higher risk for concussions than virtually any other sport, and that we cannot connect their risk of concussion in high school to a risk of CTE later in life unless they go on to become a professional football player. So we can't connect those dots, as Cara said. And while it's fair to have that worry as a parent, and while we're not saying that that's not on the table or will never be on the table, it's not a solid argument to have with your kid as you navigate the conversations about whether they can or can't play tackle football.
Exactly. And I just want to be clear, the biggest hurdle to getting the data is that this is a diagnosis that's made on autopsy. This is why until we figure out how to look at brains and acknowledge what CTE looks like, once we can figure out what CTE looks like inside a living brain, then we can actually study how many people have it in any given population. But right now, it's an autopsy diagnosis. There is a direct connection between mood disorder, especially depression, and CTE, a massive number. I want to say all, but I don't know that I can say all and be accurate. But so I'm going to say almost all people who were diagnosed with CTE postmortem were clinically depressed. We know there is a very clear connection. So that is a place where a lot of parents and researchers are starting to spend their time and energy. They're trying to say, if my child who's in a contact sport and a tackle sport or a contact sport is starting to be depressed, is this an early sign of CTE? Yes, it might be. But I want to be clear. I'm going to be editorial, which I don't usually get to editorial, but I'm going to be editorial about my personal feelings here because I think it's really important to share an opinion based upon what, it's just my opinion. Other people will have other opinions. My kids were never in sports that were predicated on tackling. Neither of my children played tackle football. I say that because I think all sports should be open to all kids. And so that's because I've been reading this data forever and ever. To your point, Vanessa, when you look at the list of sports that are associated with concussion, my kids did play a number of those sports at an intro level, but the more physical and aggressive they got, shocker of the century. My kids were like, take me out and put me in a sport where you don't run that risk. So it was a self-solving crisis, but I
Right.
probably wouldn't have been comfortable with them in those sports. I will be honest.
Yeah. And I have 4 kids who played half the sports on the
Yep.
list, not tackle football, as I mentioned earlier, but many of the other sports on the
Yep.
list. And they were and still do play many of the sports on the list. So, in response to the listener question, I think the data and the medical stuff we've sort of dealt with. If you're going to go into it, you go into it knowing what the risks are. But the second half of the question really addresses some of the really powerful social and communal elements of playing a sport. I so feel that worry about, taking away something that your kid really loves and is passionate about when they've tried other things. You don't want to take that away from them. I really appreciate in this world of just deeply competitive athletics, having a sport that doesn't make cuts so that every kid can participate. As a parent of 4 high schoolers and former high schoolers, their experiences on the sports field have been incredibly important, not just because of the physical activity, but because of the experience of being part of a team, of being mentored by older students, by being mentored by coaches. So we cannot make that decision for you. All we can do is validate the very real dilemma that the listener is having. And frankly, and maybe this person has done it already, but to lay out the risks to your child. I mean, if they're old enough to advocate for themselves and to make the case for being able to play the sport that has very real risk, laying out the risks, having a conversation, and also perhaps putting up guardrails about like, hey, listen, if X happens, I reserve the right to tell you that I'm no longer comfortable with having you play. I say that because partially that's what I have been learning to do over the years, both in the families that we work with who ask for our advice and also in my own family, which is like, here's what I'm worried about. I'm not saying it's going to come true, but if it does come true, I want to be prepared and I want to put on record that we're going to have a follow up kind of conversation.
Right. So what I love about that is you're giving them the why, right? You're explaining the rationale about why you're concerned. I would put guardrails in place that are not dependent upon their subjective feelings. For instance, if you say, if you get a concussion and it takes more than 3 days to heal, that's going to be a worrying concussion to me. And I am not going to be comfortable with you playing this sport. You're going to have a kid who, if they're really motivated to play the sport, lies to you about their symptoms so they can get back in and they don't lose access. So instead, to say, it's not going to be your fault if you get a concussion, but if you get a concussion, I'm going to need to revisit this conversation and I'm going to really need to think about my comfort level. And this is independent of how long your symptoms last or what the treatment is for you to get beyond the concussion. The last thing I will add is that this, like everything else that Vanessa and I talk about, is not one conversation.
Yeah, and I want to get at the several other conversations
So
that
go
need
for it.
to be
Yes,
had.
go for it.
So we talked about the communal pressure, right? Like if you want to be in the school, in the community, you got to do the sport. If you want to be part of a social scene, maybe you have to do the sport. If you have a kid who is carrying a lot of pressure athletically to perform for their team, who feels as if they will let their team down if they don't get out there and play, who feels as if they will be letting down their coach, who feels as if they will be letting you down. This is a moment to step back and check your own baggage on how you're managing your kid's concussion. Reflect on how your coach is treating your kid and whose best interests the coach has about your kid getting back on the field, and to have really hard, honest, and important conversations with your kid about taking the time, really being honest. I mean, I will tell you, Cara, I had a kid who was captain of the soccer team who got a concussion early on in the season in his senior year. And he felt so much pressure to get back on that field. And we had really hard, really honest conversations. And he waited and he let himself heal and he was willing to be honest. Now, at that point, he was a senior. I don't know if you have the same honest conversations with, a less mature kid. I don't know if he was in a different community at a different school, if, his coach or other people would have made him feel more pressure. But this is where your knowledge of your kid, your knowledge of their temperament, of your temperament, of your relationship and dynamic, it's a time to go and find your trusted adult and talk to that friend, that spouse, that therapist and say, hey, this is what I'm feeling about my kid, about, maybe they're being recruited for college. Maybe there's money on the line. Maybe there is potentially some kind of scholarship. I mean, there are big, big, big decisions.
Maybe it's their community.
Maybe it's all they have.
Yes.
Maybe they struggle academically and being successful on the field is their whole identity.
That's right.
And so when we think about, it's so funny when you think about, concussions, well, okay, 2 weeks and then this. No, it's about so many aspects of a kid's life and of of their school or their club team and the way they think about their future and the way they view themselves. And it's such a weird thing to say, and I'm sure people struggling with a kid with a concussion right now will tell me to piss right off. But I will say it is an opportunity to have really important, meaningful, and valuable conversations with your kid about who they are, about your relationship, about their role on their team or their school. And you may not have the same opportunities again to really reflect on all of these parts of their identity and who they are. And it provides a conduit, a channel to have those conversations.
Except if they have a really bad headache during the conversation.
Yeah. And then,
in which case, stop because they have a concussion. I do want to end this by going back to where we began and just to make an extra plug to whatever powers that be, to recognize the incredibly athletic sport of cheer as a sport. And the reason it's so important, the reason the American Academy of Pediatrics has come out and made a statement saying it's so important, is that 3.5 million kids in this country participate in cheer. Cheer, especially this, the stunt version of cheer called, wait for it, stunt cheer. Stunt cheer carries the biggest risk of concussion when kids are climbing on other kids and throwing kids in the air. And you can just imagine how concussion happens there. And if this activity is not recognized as a sport, we're missing out on important data. They're missing out on important resources and important education. So if there is anyone listening who has the power to make cheer a sport, please, I hope this has convinced you. Also, all you need to do is go watch Bring It On from the year 2000.
By the way, just as a reminder, there's some sexual content in Bring It On that you may not remember, which I only realized when watching it again with my kids. And I was like, I didn't remember that. It was like Bridget Jones's Diary. There was all sorts of stuff that was over my head. So watch Bring It On, and up to you if you want to watch it with your kids. Just be aware there may be some surprising things slipped in there, and I use that term purposefully, that you may not have remembered.
On our next podcast, we'll be talking about Cara's inappropriate movie recommendations. Vanessa, as always, it is a total pleasure.
Thanks, Cara.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.